So welcome everybody. My name's Toby Corballis. I'm delighted to be here at SEACON this year and presenting this talk. I'm going to talk to you about the three C's, COVID, cloud and change. But before I do, just a little bit about myself. I've been an Agile practitioner now for probably best part of 10 years at least. And I run a podcast called the Wicked Problems Podcast, which you can find on wickedproblems.fm. I'm also a lead associate here at eSynergy Solutions. And I'm going to talk about the wicked problem of COVID and Sensemaking with Agile. And really, it's about the confluence of COVID, cloud, and change as I see it. So, I just want to set the scene a little bit with a few slides. And I'm going to start with the trend line of cloud, right? This graphic was produced in 2018. And I think it's fair to say that what it shows is that cloud is building year on year, and it's growing exponentially. We kind of think everyone kind of knows that. It's actually, I think, a little bit wrong now in that with COVID, what's happened is that has accelerated beyond the expectations of the people who put the data together. Let's just move on. So I'm going to make a prediction. I'm going to start early with a prediction. COVID-19 will accelerate the trend. Now, that's clearly been demonstrated in the first lockdown, and I'll come on to a little bit more about that in a minute. Software providers will and are expediting migrations of their offerings into the cloud, many of them being SaaS offerings, of course. And I think that firms that don't embrace cloud technology are going to lose out to those that do. And I think that's true of Agile too. And I'll come on to both of those in a bit more detail in a minute. And if they don't embrace these technologies and methodologies, what's going to happen is they're going to be left behind and unable to catch up. That's my sense. Remote working is also going to further accelerate adoption. Workflows are going to adapt to a series of workplace interruptions. And look, we're now on our second lockdown. I'm no guru on this, but I completely can see it happening again in the future, right? I want to talk for a moment about the dogs that didn't bark. This is from a Sherlock Holmes story, and Gregory the detective says to Sherlock, "Is there anything else that you think I should know?" And Sherlock says, "The curious incident of the dog in the nighttime." And Gregory says, "But the dog didn't do anything in the nighttime." And Sherlock says, "Well, that is the curious incident." Right? And what that really is, it's about expectation versus reality. So when the first lockdown happened, there were a number of expectations. And I think a lot of those didn't come true, right? A lot of predictions didn't come true. Systems and networks wouldn't cope. In fact, largely that has proven not to be the case. And if you look at financial services, MiFID II voice capture systems adapted well, the resilience of the systems had adapted well. People wouldn't be able to work effectively. And in fact, what's happened is people have adapted to working from home quite well. I know there are some issues with that, but in general, I think people have. Trust would be an issue. Well, that looks to be largely ill-founded as a prediction. Markets would crash. They didn't. And one of the reasons they didn't is because we now these days have what are called circuit breakers, software that cuts out trading if it looks like it's going to crash. And that's been very effective. And there was a sort of thinking that there'd be a large run on funds. And again, that didn't happen because the equivalent of a circuit breaker is a redemption gate in the funds industry. Those have been put in place as well. And that's enabled liquidity to really kind of not dry up, which was another prediction. There's been a lot of volatility, yes, high volumes, but we're not out of liquidity. Some banks will go bust, they haven't, and people won't be able to lead effectively. And I think a lot of people have risen to the challenge very well. But it's not all about that. And there are things that we need to be cognizant of. I'll let people read these stats maybe offline, but just to go through a couple. 238% cyber attacks on banks, 900% up ransomware attacks just in the time of February to April. Okay, 20 to 40% of mobile and fixed line network usage, up that much. So we can see that there are things that are happening that are going to create a need for change. And part of that is down to people using basically the internet more and cloud services and Zoom calls and all the rest of it. And part of that is down to people taking prospective pot shots at, for instance, I think the UN, or let's say the WHO, attacks on the WHO have gone massively up because people want to try and get information about potential cures to COVID. What this demonstrates, I think, is that we live in what is basically a volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world, or an acronym that maybe some people have heard of, VUCA. Before we go any further, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the differences I see it between management and leadership. And this is adapted from John Cotter and Holger Rathgeber. But basically management, and sometimes I think people conflate them, right? So it's important to make this distinction. Management's about planning, it's about budgeting, organization, staff, measuring, problem solving. In other words, doing what we already know how to do, doing it exceptionally well in order to produce consistent results. Whereas leadership is more about sort of direction, finding alignment, motivation, inspiration, mobilizing for opportunity, and removing obstacles, removing barriers, right? And that is effectively agility and innovation for a prosperous future. Problems. So problems can be classified. Okay, this comes from work done by Horst Spittel and Melvin Weber back in 1973, and they did this in design thinking. And what they said was, you can classify problems in three ways, and there's arguably a fourth, but for our purposes, let's concentrate on three. One is critical. You've got to solve the problem now, right? There is no time to lose, no time to sit down and plan. And a good example of that is the first lockdown, where a lot of people had to suddenly work from home. They didn't have the equipment. They didn't have the connectivity. What did people do? They didn't sit down and plan for that. They just went out and bought the equipment and enabled people to work from home. Changed policies on the fly, etc. A second version is a Tame problem. Now, that doesn't mean it's not necessarily complex. It could be a complex problem, but it's going to be one that you've seen before or somebody you know has seen before, and the solution is known, right? A very good example of that may be building a house, right? I don't know how to do it, but I can get an architect, and there's a number of steps that we go through, and there'll be a finished product at the end of it. And the third type of problem is what's called the wicked problem. Wicked in this sense doesn't mean evil. It just means something that's never been seen before. Now, that could be contextual. You could move it across to being a Tame problem if somebody else knows about it. But very often these aren't, and they are problems that sit between across departments quite often. They have hidden impacts. They appear intractable, and they have no obvious stopping condition. And actually, we can map these, I think, onto different methodologies. So let's just look at that. In the context of a change management problem, let's say you encounter a crisis. You've got to change something within your systems. You haven't got any time to think about it. You've just got to do it. That's a critical problem, and just do it. It's not really a philosophy, is it? But it's a well-recognized acronym, I think. If it isn't a crisis and you've got a problem, have you seen it before? Have you solved it before? Has it got a stopping condition? And if the answer is yes, in my opinion, waterfall is very well suited sometimes to those problems. Now, this isn't a hard and fast graphic, but it's a very good rule of thumb, I think. So an example of that might be building a data center, right? If you're building a data center, you know you've got to do slabs on the floor before you can get the cages, before you can get the servers, etc. There's a logical order to doing the build out, and at some point it will be finished, and somebody knows how to do it, and you can probably replicate that time and time again. And then there's wicked problems, and wicked problems really lend themselves well to Agile, right? Because what are you doing in Agile? You're very often sense making. You don't know the end state. You're measuring and you're adapting and you're pivoting. So you've never seen this thing before. There's no obvious stopping condition. We build products. We don't know that the product's going to be finished in 3 months' time. We just have a roadmap, but we know that will evolve. Professor Keith Grint, who's done a lot of work on wicked problems, said to resolve a wicked problem, the leader has to reduce anxiety among team members by facilitating construction of an innovative response to the novel problem, i.e. rolling out a known process to a previously different problem is insufficient. It's not going to work. And I think that's a great quote, personally. What have we been doing in 2020? Well, we've been walking the tightrope of COVID-19, right? And walking tightropes is supposedly it's easy. One person per rope, you don't look down. But in reality, everyone's on the same rope and everyone has all looked down at the same time. And again, I just want to sort of talk a bit about what's the difference between what traditional leaders do and what agile leaders do. And really, the difference comes down to, in traditional leadership, you attempt to control the outputs, right? Well, what we do in agile is we try to control the inputs. We recognize the final destination is really in our control. We reflect and learn. We practice servant leadership, and we measure, learn, and adapt based on the feedback. So, i.e., we pivot because it makes sense, because that's what the data is telling us to do. Companies that have embraced agile, if you look at this since the last lockdown, okay, since 2000, not lockdown, excuse me, last economic downturn back in 2008. IBM, I know they've got people who do agile, but as a company, they haven't, in my view, really embraced it in the same way that, say, Apple and Microsoft have. And that's true of General Electric as well. And you can see that, I think, reflected in the market capitalization on these graphics. And there are lessons that we need to learn about from previous downturns, right? So liquidity is all important. Cash is king. Firms want to hold on to cash. They want to trim resources because that's a cash-saving thing, right? Regulatory approvals get re-engineered because things are suddenly different. Automation goes up. And what tends to happen is that the rates for generalists go down and the rates for specialists tend to go up because that automation drives it. And that creates a number of opportunities. Look, after 2008, many large banks like Morgan Stanley decided that they wouldn't use the large consultancies as much as they had been because they weren't getting as good value per dollar as they did from the more niche consultancies. And cloud-based systems, if you look at it just since the beginning of this year, they have been the best able to adapt because you can simply turn up the dial on the resources that you need much more easily than you can with traditional systems. There are going to be security uplifts. If you remember back to that slumbering dog slide, there's a lot of security problems that are going on there that need to be addressed from working from home, for example. People need to create process efficiencies. And instead of looking at a percentage of budget for IT spend, people are looking, I think, more at what value for dollar are they getting. And that's an interesting number at the bottom. I think, if you just look at Azure, it's gone up 59% this year on year from last year, the usage of it. And if you look at G Suite, which is the only thing I can get a number for on Google, but 53% year on year, cloud is going up. And this is from Gartner. COVID-19 is a wake-up call for organizations that have placed too much focus on daily operational needs at the expense of investing in digital business and long-term resilience. Businesses that can shift technology capacity and investments to digital platforms will mitigate the impact of the outbreak and keep their companies running smoothly now and over the long term. So I'm going to put all this into a case study. And this is a project that we worked on last year before COVID hit. But I think it's even more relevant now. And the outcomes that we were after, it was a Lighthouse Project. So starting small, not going too big, creating an ecosystem that we could land a couple of projects into, migrating existing systems to the public cloud, providing the management and leadership teams with understanding of how migrated existing services would look, what the migration path would look like, introducing agile ways of working. So this was in a conservative investment bank. I can't identify it for perhaps obvious reasons. And it was to demonstrate the art of the possible, let's look at this. What were the client needs, right? Well, to enable flexible business change, they wanted to drive down data center costs that were spiraling out of control. They wanted to create flexible data residency options. So, as a bank, they have to operate in a global environment, obviously. Data regulations about where you can hold data change across different locales frequently. And so you need to be able to accommodate that. Cultural readiness, they really didn't know what they didn't know. They knew that moving to Agile would be a challenge because it's a cultural shift. And so they wanted to understand how ready they were for that, which I think was a very wise thing for them to seek. And they also had a set of existing microservices that they needed to gain support for, and cloud was seen as a very good way of doing that. And what challenges did we encounter? Well, in any change project, you're going to get naysayers. It just happens. And what often happens is, and what happened here is we had, they set you pointless tasks. Go and count the exact number of grains of feed that the chickens are eating, so you know how many to buy next month. Actually, you can just weigh it, right? And key stakeholders all often have great intentions, but you've got to keep them communicated and understanding things. Otherwise, they'll win. And this is what happened with it. You get misunderstandings, you get people not paying attention, or they're not available because they think something else is more important. So you really have to engage with them. Personnel changes. Every company goes through this all the time. There are changes in personnel, and that affects priorities. Conflicts of strategy, biases, right? We spent 5 million with this provider, or whatever the number is, and the way to make sure that it comes good is to spend another 5 million with them. It's kind of escalation of commitment. Front loading with fine-grained detail, very similar to that first point, but this is where stakeholders, because they don't know any different, think that they need to have full visibility of a future state at a fine-grained detail, because that gives them comfort. And so that's a challenge that one has to overcome. We had a private cloud provider who came in and gave a free offer. Use our private cloud free for a year. And then when you looked into the offer, it wasn't free at all. And so you've got to defend against that sort of thing. And then what I call known provider insurance paradigm, right? Well, we know that if it goes wrong, we can blame these guys over here, so we're just going to employ them. And then in a sense, that's kind of planning for failure. And I think it's something that is important to guard against. What were the key ingredients that we had? Well, we had a courageous and visionary executive sponsor. That is so important. And then because of that, we had very supportive senior management, one layer down, as it were. Again, it's incredibly important. These messages have to come from the top and flow down if they're going to be taken on by the teams. We also did have a team of skilled and talented engineers and agilists working within the organization. There was a lot of mutual respect, a lot of empathy, a lot of planning. There was committed budget. We had procurement compliance on board, adherence to well-defined processes that had been defined amongst each other, and behaviors that were reinforced through feedback. So positive feedback publicly, negative feedback privately. I always think that's important. Constant backlog management, so reprioritization continually, and security baked in from the start. I'm very keen on that because often what happens in my experience is that people don't do that and then they have to retrofit, and that becomes a very expensive way of doing things. The project went on for 3 months, and in 3 months, 6.5 sprints, we gave the client a readiness analysis of 181 applications that they had. We gave them a secure production-grade AWS ecosystem with 2 demo apps migrated, a cultural readiness report from which came organizational change recommendations, and a blueprint for the operational design if they were then going to go ahead with the other 179 apps. So some key takeaways. Board level buy-in crucial. I don't think you can over-communicate. Change is people-oriented, even technical change. Leadership is vital, but so too are the people at coalface. Engineers and technicians need to be engaged early. They are your experts. Confront resistance early, right? If you don't, what tends to happen is misconceptions can morph into received wisdom, and that's not in anyone's interests. Define and tweak processes. Sprints, if they're too long, shorten them. If they're too short, lengthen them. Play around in the way that you need to until you find your cadence. WIP limits, again, same thing. Continuous reprioritization. I said that on the previous slide, I think, but it's really important. Start small, don't overcommit. If you think you're going to go in and change everything all at once, that's quite often, I think, a recipe for disaster. And I have this little golden rule, right? I never want to have more than 2 sprints open. One actually not really open, it's finished, but it's there waiting to be signed off. And you've got to acknowledge that sometimes people are busy. And one work in progress. Use tools properly. I have seen some really interesting ways that people use Kanban boards, but they weren't really very productive. And projects, realize that they're not all the same, and therefore there is no one-size-fits-all delivery mechanism. And really important, gather the data about the project, inspect, analyze, adapt, and then pivot when needed. And remember that leadership is about relationships, whereas management is about control. You might have to do both, but just understanding the difference, I think, is really key. I'm going to close with a story that I think summarizes it all very beautifully. And I think in this time of COVID that we're in, it's also really important. So this is 1951. Albert Einstein was working at Princeton University, and he set a physics exam. And the students started scribbling their names, and Einstein left the examination hall, and his assistant looked at the paper and realized that it was the same paper that had been given to the same students the year before, exactly the same paper. So he ran down the hall and said, Professor Einstein, what are we going to do? This is terrible. We're going to have to stop the exam, and we're going to have to give them new questions. And Einstein said, why on earth would we do that? Well, it's the same. It's the same. He said, my dear boy, the questions are the same, but the answers are different. And I think that's a really good way of summarizing an agile project, right? The questions are the same, but each time you go to a new project, quite often the answers are different. That's it from me. Thank you for watching. If you want to get in touch with me, please do reach out. Toby Corballis, Toby.Corballis at esynergy-solutions.co.uk. I've actually written a book about all of this. You can get it on LeanPub if you like. It's digital delivered. And there's the website for eSynergies, and also for my podcast, wickedproblems.fm, if you're interested in those. Thank you very much.